The binoculars trembled slightly in his hands. Oberst Heinrich Müller stood on the cliffs above Aramash, the salt wind sharp against his face, and stared at something that made no sense. June 7, 1944. 24 hours since the Allied invasion fleet had shattered the morning silence. The beaches below still smoked. Bodies rolled in the surf, but Müller wasn't looking at the beaches. He was looking at what was rising from the sea. Massive concrete structures, dozens of them, each one the size of a 5-story building, appearing on the horizon like floating fortresses. Behind them, strange skeletal piers extended toward the shore, assembling themselves piece by piece, as if conjured by some industrial sorcery. Ships, gray, blocky, impossibly crude, were being deliberately sunk in neat rows, forming breakwaters where none had existed before. Müller lowered the binoculars. His adjutant stood beside him, silent, pale. "They're building a harbor," Müller whispered. "Impossible, Herr Oberst. There is no harbor here." Exactly. Within 48 hours, the Americans and British would land more supplies through those artificial structures than passed through most natural ports in a month. Within 2 weeks, the tonnage would exceed 2 million tons. And the German High Command, which had spent 4 years fortifying every port along the Atlantic Wall, would realize they had prepared for the wrong war entirely. 2 years earlier, the lesson had been written in blood and failure on the beaches of Dieppe. August 19, 1942, Operation Jubilee. 6,000 Allied troops, mostly Canadian, launched a frontal assault on the heavily defended French port. The objective was simple: prove that the Allies could capture a major port, hold it long enough to resupply, and establish a foothold in Nazi-occupied Europe. Within 9 hours, nearly 4,000 men were dead, wounded, or captured. The raid was a catastrophe. But it taught the Allied command something invaluable. Seizing a fortified port was a death sentence. The Germans knew it too. From Norway to the Spanish border, General Feldmarschall Erwin Rommel and his engineers had turned every harbor, every dock, every jetty into a fortress. Concrete bunkers bristled with artillery. Minefields choked the approaches. Underwater obstacles waited to rip open landing craft. The Atlantic Wall was not a continuous line of defense. It was a necklace of fortified ports, each one designed to bleed an invasion force white before they could offload a single tank. Hitler himself had declared it. Any Allied invasion must capture a major port within days, or it will strangle on its own logistics. He was right. An army doesn't run on courage or firepower alone. It runs on fuel, ammunition, food, medicine, replacement parts, and reinforcements. A modern mechanized force consumes thousands of tons of supplies every single day. Without a port, without cranes and docks and warehouses, an invasion force would be like a fire without oxygen, bright, violent, and doomed to collapse. The German High Command studied the Allied preparations throughout 1943 and early 1944. Intelligence reports tracked the buildup of men and materiel in southern England. Reconnaissance flights photographed landing craft by the thousands. Every indicator pointed to an invasion. But where? And more importantly, which port would they target? Calais was the obvious choice. Closest to England, largest port capacity. Rommel reinforced it until it resembled a medieval fortress wrapped in steel and concrete. Cherbourg, at the tip of the Cotentin Peninsula, received similar treatment. Le Havre, Boulogne, Dunkirk, every harbor became a killing ground. The Germans made a fundamental assumption: the Allies would need a port immediately. Standard military doctrine demanded it. Every historical amphibious operation, from Gallipoli to the Pacific Island campaigns, had targeted ports or natural harbors. Without one, logistics would collapse within a week. The textbooks all agreed. Winston Churchill disagreed. In the spring of 1942, shortly after Dieppe, Churchill scribbled a note to his Chief of Combined Operations, Lord Louis Mountbatten.
Piers for use on beaches. They must float up and down with the tide. The anchor problem must be mastered. Let me have the best solution worked out. Don't argue the matter. The difficulties will argue for themselves.
That bordered on fantasy. Build a harbor, not capture one, build one. From scratch, in enemy waters, large enough to supply an entire invasion force. The engineering challenges were staggering. The English Channel has some of the highest tidal ranges in the world, up to 23 feet between low and high tide. Storms can rise with terrifying speed, generating waves that have sunk battleships. The Normandy coast has no natural shelter, no reefs, no islands to provide protection, and whatever structure the Allies built would have to be assembled under fire within days of the initial landings by men who would simultaneously be fighting for their lives. Most engineers thought it couldn't be done. Some thought Churchill had lost his mind. But a small team of British engineers, led by civil engineer Harold Wills, began working on the problem in absolute secrecy. Their solution was audacious. Don't capture a port. Don't wait for engineers to repair one. Bring the port with you. The concept had three components. First, breakwaters to shield the harbor from waves and storms. Second, floating piers that could rise and fall with the tide while remaining connected to the shore. Third, artificial quays where ships could dock and unload directly onto trucks and trains. They called it Mulberry, a random code name chosen to reveal nothing. The breakwaters would be formed by two types of structures. Bombardons were massive floating steel cruciform shapes anchored in the outer perimeter to break up wave action. But the real backbone would be the Phoenix caissons, hollow concrete structures, each one weighing up to 6,000 tons that could be floated across the channel, then sunk in precise positions to form a solid wall against the sea. Concrete ships, deliberate shipwrecks arranged into geometry. The piers would be whales, flexible roadways made of steel spans resting on floating pontoons called beetles. They would stretch from the caissons all the way to the beach, rising and falling with the tide like mechanical serpents, allowing trucks to drive directly from ships to shore regardless of water level. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it required construction on a scale never attempted before.
By late 1943, the British countryside had transformed into a vast, secret construction zone. From the Firth of Forth in Scotland to the shipyards of Southampton, tens of thousands of workers labored on components whose purpose they didn't fully understand. In the Thames estuary, massive concrete caissons rose like industrial cathedrals, each Phoenix unit large enough to contain a 4-story building reinforced with steel rebar, fitted with compartments that could be flooded or pumped dry to control buoyancy. Some had anti-aircraft guns mounted on top. Others had accommodation for crews who would sail them across the channel. The scale was staggering. Over 200 major Phoenix caissons had to be built. Each one required thousands of tons of concrete, precise engineering tolerances, and weeks of curing time. They had to be watertight, structurally sound enough to withstand storm waves, and light enough to float, at least until they reached their destination. In addition, 23 old merchant ships and 4 obsolete warships were designated as corncobs, block ships that would be deliberately scuttled to form the outer breakwater line. Among them were ships that had served in World War I, cargo vessels pulled from the Atlantic convoys, even the cruiser HMS Durban. Each would sail one final mission, then die to protect the invasion. The floating roadways required different expertise. Engineers designed telescoping steel spans that could extend and contract with the tides. Pontoons had to be built to support them, massive floating platforms that could bear the weight of tanks, trucks, and constant traffic while remaining stable in choppy seas. The whale piers were marvels of mechanical engineering with hydraulic systems and flexible joints that allowed them to move like living things. Security around the operation was absolute. Workers knew only their specific task. Welders didn't know what the caissons were for. Concrete pourers didn't know where the structures would go. Rumors were inevitable, but the truth was so audacious that most dismissed it as impossible anyway. Who would believe Britain was building artificial harbors to tow across the English Channel? German intelligence, despite its sophistication, never grasped the full picture. Reconnaissance flights photographed the construction sites, but analysts interpreted the concrete structures as anti-aircraft platforms, coastal defenses, or possibly components for Atlantic wall fortifications intended for Britain's own coast. The idea that they were mobile harbor components never seriously entered German planning documents. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, did intercept fragments of information. A decoded message mentioned synthetic harbors. Another referenced large-scale concrete construction in unusual locations. But these reports were filed alongside thousands of other pieces of intelligence, some accurate, many misleading, all competing for attention. In the fog of information warfare, the Mulberry secret remained hidden. Part of the deception came from the Allies' broader strategy. Operation Fortitude, the massive deception campaign, convinced German high command that the invasion would come at Pas de Calais. Dummy equipment, fake radio traffic, and an entire phantom army under General Patton kept German eyes focused on the wrong coastline. The Normandy preparations, including the Mulberry components, were part of what German intelligence analysts believed was a secondary or diversionary force. Rommel himself toured the Atlantic wall defenses in early 1944, inspecting bunkers and obstacles with meticulous attention. He calculated logistics, studied tidal charts, and reinforced key ports. His reports to Berlin repeatedly emphasized the importance of denying the Allies access to harbor facilities. If they cannot capture Cherbourg or Le Havre in 48 hours, their invasion will fail. He never considered they might not need to capture a port at all.
By May 1944, the components were ready. Over 400 separate structures had to be moved into position in absolute secrecy. Caissons were towed to assembly points along the southern coast of England. Bombardons were staged in sheltered bays. Thousands of tons of steel roadway sections waited in depots. Ships designated as corn cobs were crewed and prepared for their final voyages. The plan called for 2 complete Mulberry harbors. Mulberry A would be established at Omaha Beach in the American sector. Mulberry B would be built at Aramash in the British-Canadian Gold Beach sector. Each harbor would have the capacity to land thousands of tons of supplies per day, roughly equivalent to the throughput of Dover, one of Britain's busiest ports. The towing operation alone was a logistical nightmare. The Phoenix caissons were too large to be pulled quickly. They would lumber across the channel at 2 to 3 knots, vulnerable to U-boats, mines, and storms. Timing was everything. They couldn't leave too early, German reconnaissance would spot them. They couldn't leave too late, the invasion force would be stranded on the beaches without resupply. D-Day was set for early June, dependent on weather, tides, and moon phase. The Mulberry components would begin crossing the channel within hours of the first landings. Crews trained in Scotland, practicing the precise choreography of positioning and sinking caissons in designated spots. Naval officers studied detailed charts showing where each Phoenix unit would rest on the seabed. Weather became the final variable. Early June 1944 saw some of the worst storm conditions in decades. General Eisenhower postponed the invasion once. Forecasters predicted a brief window of marginal improvement, enough to launch, but far from ideal. On June 5th, Eisenhower made the decision. Okay, let's go. At dawn on June 6, 1944, over 5,000 ships approached the Normandy coast. The largest amphibious invasion in history was underway. On the cliffs above, German defenders opened fire. In bunkers and trenches, they watched the armada with growing dread, certain that this was the main assault, but still convinced it would fail without capturing a major port. They had no idea what was coming behind the first wave. The engineering was almost medieval in its simplicity, wrapped in modern industrial scale. The Phoenix caissons were hollow concrete boxes, but their design borrowed principles from ancient harbor construction, mass, weight, and gravity holding back the sea. Roman engineers had built breakwaters by sinking timber frames filled with rubble. The Mulberry designers did the same, but with reinforced concrete and precision engineering. Each caisson had multiple compartments. Crews could flood specific chambers to control how the structure settled on the seabed. If it tilted during sinking, pumps could correct the balance. Once in position, valves were opened, seawater rushed in, and 6,000 tons of concrete became an immovable wall. But concrete is brittle. It cracks under stress, so engineers embedded thousands of tons of steel reinforcement bars, rebar grids that gave the structure's tensile strength. The walls were 4 feet thick in some places. The bases were designed to spread the weight across soft sand and clay without punching through. Some units had internal bracing that could withstand the impact of storm waves hitting at 15-foot heights. The largest Phoenix caissons stood 60 feet tall. When sunk, their tops protruded above even the highest tides, creating a continuous barrier. Smaller units filled gaps and corners. Anti-aircraft crews stationed on some of the platforms provided air defense during the crossing and after placement. These concrete fortresses weren't just harbor walls, they were floating gun platforms, supply depots, and command posts. Yet for all their mass and strength, they remained vulnerable during the crossing. A single torpedo could rupture the compartments, flooding them prematurely and sending them to the bottom mid-channel. U-boats prowled the waters. German E-boats, fast attack craft, operated nightly raids from French ports. The towing convoys were slow, visible, and defenseless except for destroyer escorts. The men operating the Mulberry components knew they were sailing targets. Among them was Chief Petty Officer James McAllister, a merchant sailor from Glasgow who'd survived 2 torpedo attacks in the Atlantic. He was assigned to a Phoenix caisson crew, 12 men tasked with guiding one of the concrete giants across the channel. They lived inside the structure during the crossing, sleeping in cramped compartments, monitoring pumps and valves, ready to correct any list or flooding. It was like being inside a floating tomb, McAllister later wrote. Concrete walls sweating with condensation, the constant groan of the tow cables. We knew if a U-boat hit us, there'd be no escape. The compartments would flood in seconds, and 6,000 tons of concrete doesn't bob on the surface waiting for rescue. Yet the crews volunteered. They understood what was at stake. Every ton of ammunition, every gallon of fuel, every tank and truck the invasion force needed depended on getting these structures into position. Without the Mulberry harbors, the men on the beaches would be cut off, encircled, and destroyed. The human cost of the construction had already been paid. 5 workers died during the building of the Phoenix caissons when a partially completed unit collapsed during a storm in early 1944. Another 7 were killed in industrial accidents, cranes failing, scaffolding collapsing, the brutal pace of construction leaving little room for safety margins. Their names were never publicized. The project was too secret, the timeline too urgent. Even the civilian population near construction sites paid a price. Entire villages were evacuated in southern England to make room for assembly areas. Fishermen were banned from sections of coastline. Farmers watched as their fields were requisitioned and covered with concrete and steel. The government compensated them, but the disruption was absolute and unexplained. Only after D-Day would they understand what had been built in their backyards. The Germans, meanwhile, had made their own calculations, and those calculations were fatally confident. In bunkers along the Atlantic Wall, officers studied logistics tables and tonnage requirements. Their analysis was technically correct. An Allied invasion force of the size gathering in England would require at least 10,000 tons of supplies per day within the first week, rising to 20,000 tons per day by the end of the first month. Without a functioning port, that was impossible. Landing craft could bring men and light equipment, but tanks, artillery, trucks, and bulk supplies needed cranes, docks, and warehouses. Therefore, the Allies would have to capture a port, Cherbourg was the obvious target, and hold it long enough to repair the damage German demolitions would inevitably cause. Rommel's engineers had prepared every port for total destruction. Docks rigged with explosives, cranes wired to collapse, harbor channels blocked with sunken ships. Even if the Allies took Cherbourg on D-Day, it would be weeks before it could handle significant cargo. That gave the Germans time to bring up reinforcements, time to launch counterattacks, time to strangle the invasion before it could build momentum. German confidence wasn't arrogance, it was math. Every military academy in Europe taught the same principles. Logistics governed warfare. Napoleon had said it, Clausewitz had written it, the textbooks agreed. No port, no supply, no victory. But the textbooks were about to be rewritten. The tactical challenge of placing the Mulberry components was something no navy had attempted before. Standard harbor construction happens in peacetime with surveying teams, dredging equipment, and months of preparation. The Mulberry harbors would be assembled in the middle of an active battle zone, under artillery fire, with German bombers overhead and enemy coastal guns targeting anything that moved offshore. Naval engineers developed a placement system based on precise coordinates and pre-arranged markers. Each Phoenix caisson had a designated spot on detailed charts. Survey ships would reach the area first, drop marker buoys, and establish reference points. Following vessels would tow the caissons into position, align them with the buoys, and begin the sinking process. In theory, it was straightforward. In practice, it required executing complex maneuvers under combat conditions with structures that responded to steering about as well as office buildings. The first caissons began arriving off Normandy on June 7th, D-Day +1. German artillery immediately ranged in on them. Shells erupted around the towing vessels. One caisson took a direct hit from an 88mm gun, but the round punched through the hollow interior without detonating. The crew flooded the damaged compartment and continued positioning. By June 9th, enough Phoenix units were in place to form partial breakwaters. Ships began sheltering behind them, offloading supplies while still in relatively rough water. The whale piers were being assembled simultaneously. Sections floated out and connected like massive floating Lego pieces. Pontoons were positioned, steel spans locked into place, and the first trucks drove from ship to shore across roadways that rose and fell with every wave. German observers watching from the cliffs couldn't believe what they were seeing. It violated everything they knew about engineering and logistics. Harbors took years to build. These were appearing in days.
But the weather was watching too. The English Channel is famously treacherous. Summer storms can generate waves that dwarf anything in the Mediterranean. On June 19th, just as the Mulberry harbors were becoming fully operational, the worst storm in 40 years slammed into Normandy. Winds exceeded force 6, waves topped 15 feet. The sea turned into a gray maelstrom that smashed landing craft against the shore and sent ships dragging their anchors. For 3 days, the storm raged. The partially completed Mulberry A at Omaha Beach took the brunt of it. Phoenix caissons, not yet fully settled, shifted under the wave impacts. Some tilted and collapsed. The flexible whale piers, designed to move with the tides, were hammered by waves far beyond their design limits. Steel spans buckled. Pontoons broke loose and were hurled onto the beach. By June 22nd, when the storm finally subsided, Mulberry A was wrecked, a twisted graveyard of concrete and steel stretching along Omaha Beach. Mulberry B at Arromanches survived, barely. Its position offered slightly better shelter from prevailing winds. Some Phoenix units had been positioned deeper, giving them better stability, but even there, damage was extensive. Sections of the whale piers had to be rebuilt. Pontoons were recovered and repositioned. Engineers worked around the clock in the storm's aftermath, salvaging what they could. The Americans made a command decision: don't rebuild Mulberry A. Instead, cannibalize its components to reinforce Mulberry B and push for the capture of Cherbourg. Resources were redirected. The British would handle the artificial harbor, the Americans would take the port. Yet even in its damaged state, Mulberry B performed beyond expectations. By late June, despite the storm, the harbor at Arromanches was offloading 7,000 tons of supplies per day. Trucks drove directly from Liberty ships onto the floating roadways, then onto the beach and into the interior.
Fuel pipelines were laid across the piers. Ammunition dumps were established behind the beaches. The logistical miracle the German planners said was impossible was happening in real time. A German intelligence report from late June, captured after the war, revealed the depth of their shock. Enemy has constructed artificial harbor facilities of immense scale at Arromanches, concrete structures estimated at battalion strength in materials alone. Implications for future operations require immediate strategic reassessment. Recommend... The report ended there, never completed, as the officer writing it was killed in an Allied air raid. The tonnage figures told the story. By the end of July, Mulberry B had landed over 500,000 tons of supplies. By September, the total exceeded 2 million tons, roughly equivalent to everything that passed through the port of Liverpool in 6 months, but landed on an open beach with no natural protection except what engineers had built from scratch. The moral angle was quieter, but equally important. Allied troops on the beaches knew they wouldn't be abandoned. They could see the harbor growing offshore. They watched the ships arriving with food, ammunition, and reinforcements. It changed the psychology of the invasion. Men fight harder when they know resupply is coming. They hold ground longer when they aren't worried about running out of bullets. The Germans, conversely, faced the opposite realization. Rommel's promise that the Allies would be thrown back into the sea within days was collapsing. The invasion wasn't a raid, it wasn't a desperate gamble. It was a sustained, methodical operation backed by industrial logistics that seemed limitless. The concrete walls rising from the sea weren't just harbor structures, they were symbols of Allied material superiority, of engineering capacity that Germany couldn't match. One captured German officer, interrogated in late June, summed it up. "We knew you had more tanks, more planes, but we thought we could destroy your logistics. Now you bring your own harbors. How do we fight that?" June 6, 1944, 06:30 hours. The first wave hit the beaches. Omaha Beach became an abattoir. Men fell in the surf. Tanks drowned in deep water. Artillery fire raked the shoreline. But Utah, Gold, Juneau, and Sword beaches saw better success. By midday, Allied forces had footholds, bloody, contested, but established. And behind the assault waves, the logistical armada was already moving. At 1400 hours on D-Day, the first block ships, old freighters and obsolete warships designated as corn cobs, approached the Normandy coast. These vessels had sailed their last mission. Crews set charges, opened seacocks, and abandoned ship. One by one, they settled onto the seabed in predetermined positions, forming the initial breakwater line. The cruiser HMS Durban, which had fought in World War I and escorted Atlantic convoys for years, went down off Arromanches at precisely 15:20 hours. Her superstructure remained above water, a skeletal monument marking the outer edge of what would become Mulberry B. 23 ships died that day, each one carefully positioned to break wave action and provide initial shelter for the landing craft still shuttling men and equipment ashore. By the morning of June 7th, the first Phoenix caissons arrived. They came slowly, pulled by ocean-going tugs at walking pace. From the German positions on the cliffs, they appeared surreal, massive concrete blocks that shouldn't float, moving across the water like industrial icebergs. Forward artillery observers called in fire missions. Shells bracketed the towing convoys. One tug was hit and sank, but the caisson it was pulling was picked up by another vessel and continued toward the beach. The sinking process was precise and dangerous. Each Phoenix had to be positioned within 50 yards of its designated spot. Too far off and gaps would form in the breakwater. Overlapping placements could cause structural instability. Naval engineers used buoys, compass bearings, and shouted orders across the water to guide the massive structures into place. Once positioned, valves were opened. Seawater flooded the internal compartments. The caisson began to settle. Crews monitored the descent, adjusting ballast to keep the structure level. A 6,000-ton concrete box sinking crooked could tip, crack, or land partially on top of another unit already on the seabed. Everything depended on coordination, timing, and luck. Chief Petty Officer McAllister's Phoenix unit sank on the morning of June 8th. We heard the water rushing into the lower compartments, he recalled. The whole structure shuddered. Then we felt it touch bottom, a grinding, groaning sound that went through the concrete like a living thing. We had maybe 2 minutes to evacuate through the top hatch before the interior was completely flooded. His crew scrambled out onto the roof of the caisson as seawater rose inside. A launch picked them up, and they watched as their Phoenix settled into its final position, the top 15 feet remaining above the high tide line. Around them, other caissons were doing the same, a line of concrete fortresses rising from the sea, forming a wall against the Atlantic. By June 9th, partial breakwaters existed at both Omaha and Arromanches. Ships could shelter behind them during offloading. Landing craft could approach the beaches without battling the full force of channel waves. The next phase began, assembling the floating piers. The whale units were engineering marvels of articulation and flexibility. Each pier consisted of steel roadway sections supported by floating pontoons called beetles. The pontoons were 30 feet long, buoyant enough to support trucks and tanks, but flexible enough to ride the waves without breaking. Steel spans connected them with hinged joints that allowed the entire structure to undulate like a serpent. Assembly crews worked in teams, connecting spans while under sporadic German artillery fire. A single shell hitting a pontoon could sink it, breaking the roadway and halting all traffic. Damage control teams followed immediately behind the builders, ready to replace damaged sections. Lieutenant Commander Edward Ellsberg, an American salvage expert attached to the Mulberry operation, described the scene. Imagine building a highway while someone is shooting at you, and the highway is floating on water and rising and falling 20 feet with every tide. Now do it under enemy fire with men who've been awake for 3 days straight. That's what we did. The first whale pier reached from the Phoenix breakwater to Gold Beach on June 11th. A British lorry drove across it, tentatively at first, then with growing confidence. The roadway flexed and swayed, but held. By evening, a steady stream of vehicles was rolling from ships to shore. No cranes, no docks, no traditional harbor infrastructure, just floating roadways held together with hinges and hope. At Omaha Beach, the American Mulberry A was progressing more slowly. The beach was still under heavier German fire. Underwater obstacles remained. But by June 14th, sections of the floating piers were operational and tonnage began flowing. Then came the storm. The Germans didn't cause it, nature did, but it was the most effective counterattack the invasion faced in its first 3 weeks. On June 19th, barometric pressure plummeted, winds shifted to the northeast, the worst possible direction for the Normandy coast. By midday, waves were topping 12 feet. By evening, they reached 15. The half-finished Mulberry harbors, designed to withstand typical summer conditions, were being tested by a storm that meteorologists later classified as the worst June tempest in 4 decades.
The storm hit with escalating fury through the night of June 19th into the 20th. At Omaha Beach, Mulberry A began to disintegrate. Phoenix caissons that hadn't fully settled were struck by wave action that exceeded their design limits. One unit shifted, tilting at a 15-degree angle. The movement created a gap in the breakwater. Waves poured through, slamming into the floating piers behind the wall. Whale roadway sections buckled, steel spans twisted and snapped. Pontoons broke loose from their moorings and were hurled onto the beach, crushing supply dumps and vehicles. Crews tried to respond, but the violence of the storm made it impossible. Men attempting to reach damaged sections in small boats were swamped. One launch capsized, drowning 4 engineers. The wind was too strong for salvage equipment. All they could do was watch as months of construction came apart in hours. By the morning of June 20th, Mulberry A was in ruins. The outer breakwater had held. Most of the Phoenix units were too massive to be moved by even storm waves, but the inner structures, the piers and roadways, were destroyed.
Sections of roadway littered the beach. Pontoons lay half buried in sand. What had been a functioning harbor was now wreckage. Admiral John Hall, commanding American naval forces at Omaha, surveyed the damage and made the decision not to rebuild. Cherbourg was the priority. The 4th Infantry Division and elements of the 9th were already fighting their way up the Cotentin Peninsula. Better to focus resources on capturing and repairing an actual port than trying to reconstruct an artificial one that nature had just proven vulnerable. Mulberry B at Arromanches faced the same storm but survived, barely. Its position offered marginally better shelter from the prevailing winds. The Phoenix caissons there had been sunk deeper with better stability, but the storm still inflicted terrible damage. Several whale pier sections were destroyed, pontoons broke loose, an ammunition barge being offloaded was torn from its moorings and smashed against the caisson breakwater, exploding in a fireball that killed 17 men and sent flaming debris across the harbor. British engineers responded with ferocious determination. Damage control parties worked through the storm in conditions that would have shut down any civilian operation. They cut loose damaged sections to prevent them from destroying adjacent structures. They repositioned pontoons. They welded repairs onto twisted steel spans while waves crashed over them. Lieutenant Richard Pym, a Royal Navy engineer, later wrote, "We weren't thinking about heroism or duty. We were thinking that if this harbor fails, the men at the front don't get ammunition. It was that simple. So we worked until we couldn't stand. Then we worked some more." The storm finally broke on June 22nd. The sea calmed, the winds dropped, and the full extent of the damage became clear. Mulberry A, total loss. American forces would rely on landing craft and the eventual capture of Cherbourg. Mulberry B, badly damaged but operational. Repairs began immediately. Sections salvaged from Mulberry A were towed to Arromanches to reinforce the British harbor. Replacement pontoons arrived from England. Within a week, Mulberry B was handling 5,000 tons per day again. Within 2 weeks, it exceeded pre-storm capacity. The German reaction was complex, a mixture of relief and deepening dread. Rommel's headquarters received reports of the storm damage with something close to hope. Perhaps nature had accomplished what German artillery couldn't. Perhaps the Allied logistics would collapse after all. But reconnaissance flights over Arromanches in early July revealed that the harbor was not only functioning, it was expanding. More Phoenix caissons were being added, replacement piers were being installed, the tonnage flow hadn't stopped. A captured German staff report from early July, found in the wreckage of a destroyed headquarters near Caen, included this passage. Allied construction at Arromanches continues despite storm damage. Enemy logistics capability appears unlimited. Concrete harbor structures now extend over 3 kilometers. Estimated capacity exceeds 15,000 tons daily. Implications: prolonged defense of Normandy unsustainable without equivalent resupply capability. No such capability exists. The Wehrmacht was being outbuilt. Not outfought, German soldiers were still defending every hedgerow with ferocious skill, but outbuilt. For every tank they destroyed, 3 more arrived. For every artillery piece they knocked out, 5 replacements came ashore. The Mulberry Harbor at Arromanches was the visible symbol of that industrial disparity. By late July, American forces had captured Cherbourg, though German demolitions left the port wrecked and largely unusable for weeks. Mulberry B, meanwhile, continued operating at full capacity. On July 31st, it offloaded 11,000 tons in a single day, a throughput rate that exceeded many peacetime commercial ports.
German counterattacks against the harbor were attempted but ineffective. Luftwaffe bombers targeted the structure repeatedly, but Allied air superiority made daylight raids suicidal and nighttime attacks inaccurate. One bomber managed to hit a Phoenix caisson directly with a 500-kilogram bomb. The explosion left a crater in the concrete, but the caisson didn't sink or shift. Its sheer mass absorbed the blast.
E-boats, German fast attack craft, launched torpedo runs against ships offloading at the harbor. Most attacks were driven off by destroyer escorts. One torpedo did strike a Liberty ship moored at the pier, but the ship's cargo was flour and canned goods, not explosives. It sank slowly, was patched, and later salvaged. The harbor kept operating. The most effective German weapon against Mulberry B wasn't military, it was exhaustion. The crews maintaining and operating the harbor were working 20-hour shifts day after day. Injuries from fatigue became common. Men fell asleep while welding and burned themselves. Equipment failures increased as maintenance was deferred to keep the supply flow moving. But the harbor held. Through July, through August, into September, the concrete walls stood firm, the floating piers rose and fell with the tides, and the trucks kept rolling. 2 million tons landed, then 2.5. By the time conventional ports were fully operational in autumn, Mulberry B had delivered more supplies than passed through any single port in Europe during a comparable period. The invasion that was supposed to fail for lack of logistics had succeeded because engineers had built a harbor where none existed. By September 1944, the strategic picture in Western Europe had transformed completely. The Allied breakout from Normandy, Operation Cobra, had shattered the German defensive line. American armored divisions were racing across France. British and Canadian forces were liberating Belgium. The Wehrmacht was in full retreat, its logistics collapsing, its reserves exhausted. And behind the advancing armies, the supply chain flowed unbroken from the artificial harbor at Arromanches. The final tonnage figures for Mulberry B were staggering. From June 1944 to November 1944, the harbor offloaded over 2.5 million tons of supplies. That included 500,000 vehicles ranging from jeeps to heavy tanks. Fuel pipelines laid across the whale piers delivered millions of gallons of gasoline directly to supply dumps inland. Ammunition, medical supplies, replacement equipment, everything an army needed to sustain offensive operations poured across those floating roadways. By comparison, the port of Cherbourg, captured in late June, didn't become fully operational until mid-August due to German demolitions. Even then, its capacity was limited by damaged cranes and blocked harbor channels. Antwerp, the largest port in Europe, wasn't captured until September and didn't open for supply shipments until November because the Germans held the Scheldt estuary. For 5 critical months, Mulberry B was the primary logistics artery feeding the Allied advance. The human cost of operating the harbor became clearer in the aftermath. Over 40 engineers and naval personnel were killed in accidents during construction and operation. Another 100 were seriously injured. Many more suffered from exhaustion-related illnesses. The casualty rate among harbor workers was lower than among combat infantry, but higher than typical rear echelon services. Maintaining a floating harbor under combat conditions was dangerous work. The storm of June 19 to 22 had killed 31 men directly, most from drowning when vessels capsized, others from accidents during the emergency response. Their names were recorded in naval casualty lists, but their deaths received little attention compared to the infantry battles raging inland. They were the invisible casualties of logistics warfare. For the Germans, the aftermath of Mulberry's success was strategic collapse. Rommel had predicted that without capturing a port, the Allies would be pushed back within 2 weeks. He'd been wrong. His defensive strategy had been based on denying the enemy logistics, but the enemy had brought their own logistics infrastructure with them. By mid-July, with the Normandy front stabilizing into a grinding attritional battle, Rommel understood that Germany couldn't win. The industrial and logistical disparity was simply too great. On July 17th, Rommel was severely wounded when his staff car was strafed by Allied fighters. He never returned to active command. Months later, implicated in the July 20th plot to assassinate Hitler, he was forced to commit suicide.
The Atlantic wall he had fortified so meticulously had been bypassed not by superior tactics, but by superior engineering. German commanders who survived the war universally cited logistics as the critical factor in their defeat in Normandy. General Heinrich Eberbach, captured in August 1944, stated during interrogation, "We could have stopped your tanks, we could have held the hedgerows for months, but we couldn't stop your supplies. The harbor you built at Arromanches, we had no answer for that. It changed the entire equation of the campaign." Captured German intelligence documents from late summer 1944 revealed the depth of their miscalculation. One German logistics analysis dated August 10, 1944, calculated that Allied supply throughput was running at 400% of what German planners had deemed necessary for sustained operations. The report concluded that either Allied forces were being catastrophically wasteful or German assumptions about logistical requirements were fundamentally wrong.
It was the latter. Allied mechanized warfare required immense supply volumes, but the Mulberry harbor could deliver them. German defensive plans hadn't accounted for that possibility. The immediate strategic impact was the liberation of France. Without Mulberry B, the breakout from Normandy would have stalled. Tanks would have run out of fuel. Artillery would have exhausted its ammunition. Infantry would have lacked replacements. The invasion might still have succeeded eventually once ports were captured and repaired, but the timeline would have stretched by months, possibly into 1945. That delay would have had enormous consequences. More months of German occupation in France, more time for V-2 rocket attacks on London, more time for the Eastern Front to develop differently. The entire endgame of World War II in Europe might have shifted. Cherbourg finally became fully operational in late August, 2 months after its capture. American engineers had found the port utterly wrecked. Germans had demolished every crane, scuttled ships in the harbor entrance, flooded the dry docks, and planted thousands of mines. Clearing the harbor required salvage teams, divers, and massive reconstruction efforts. Even when it reopened, capacity was limited. Mulberry B continued to handle the majority of British and Canadian logistics through the autumn. Antwerp posed an even greater challenge. Captured relatively intact in early September, it couldn't be used until Allied forces cleared the Scheldt estuary, a brutal campaign that lasted into November and cost thousands of casualties. Until then, supplies had to flow through the artificial harbor and smaller ports like Dieppe and Ostend. The logistical strain showed. By late September, Allied forces advancing into Belgium and Holland were outrunning their supply lines. Operation Market Garden, the ambitious airborne assault to capture bridges across the Rhine, failed partly because ground forces couldn't push forward fast enough. They lacked fuel, ammunition, and reinforcements. Even Mulberry's massive capacity had limits when armies were advancing hundreds of miles inland. Ironically, the harbor's success created new problems. With supplies flowing so freely in the early months, Allied commanders grew accustomed to abundance. When the supply lines stretched thin in autumn, the sudden scarcity caused friction. Patton's 3rd Army and Montgomery's 21st Army Group competed for limited fuel allocations. The broad front versus narrow thrust strategic debate partly stemmed from logistics constraints that Mulberry had temporarily masked. Still, the harbor continued operating into November 1944, long after conventional wisdom said it would be destroyed by autumn storms. Engineers reinforced it continuously. Additional caissons were added. Damaged sections were replaced. By the time it was finally decommissioned in late November, with Antwerp fully operational and Cherbourg restored, it had far exceeded its original design lifespan. Some of the Phoenix caissons remain visible today off Arromanches. Concrete walls still protrude from the water at low tide, worn by 70 years of wave action but fundamentally intact. They've become artificial reefs, hosting marine ecosystems and serving as a physical monument to the engineering feat accomplished in summer 1944. The long-term impact on military doctrine was profound.
The Mulberry harbors proved that amphibious invasions didn't require capturing existing ports. Logistics could be brought ashore through artificial means if the engineering was sufficiently ambitious. This lesson shaped every major amphibious operation afterward. The U.S. military studied the Mulberry experience intensively. Post-war amphibious doctrine incorporated prefabricated port facilities, floating piers, and rapid harbor construction. The Korean War saw similar techniques used at Incheon. Vietnam logistics relied heavily on floating storage and offloading systems derived from Mulberry principles. Even modern military sealift capabilities trace lineage back to the concrete caissons and floating roadways of Normandy. British civil engineering gained international recognition. The firms that designed and built the Mulberry components, companies like Costain, John Moleman Company, and Holloway Brothers, became global leaders in marine construction. The expertise developed during the war led to major post-war projects: harbor construction in Africa and Asia, offshore oil platforms, and eventually floating airport proposals. The technological legacy extended beyond military applications. The principles of floating structures, articulated connections, and modular construction influenced civilian maritime engineering for decades. Modern floating bridges, mobile offshore drilling platforms, and even floating airport concepts owe intellectual debts to the engineers who figured out how to build a harbor that could cross an ocean. There was a human legacy too. The crews who operated Mulberry B formed veteran associations after the war. They'd shared an experience unlike any other, living and working on a floating concrete city under combat conditions, maintaining infrastructure that shouldn't have existed but did. Their reunions continued into the 21st century, dwindling gatherings of elderly men who remembered when they'd driven trucks across roadways that rose and fell 20 feet with the tide. Chief Petty Officer McAllister, who survived the war and lived until 2003, gave an interview in 1994 on the 50th anniversary of D-Day. He was asked what he remembered most about the Mulberry operation. "The improbability of it," he said. "Every engineer I knew said it couldn't be done. Too big, too complex, too dangerous, but we did it anyway, because the alternative was letting the invasion fail. Looking back, I still can't quite believe we pulled it off, but there it is, still sitting in the water off Arromanches. Concrete doesn't lie." The financial cost was enormous. Mulberry harbors consumed resources equivalent to building a major warship, millions of pounds sterling, thousands of man-hours, and industrial capacity that could have produced tanks or aircraft. Critics after the war questioned whether the investment was justified, given that Mulberry A was destroyed and conventional ports were eventually captured anyway. But those critics missed the crucial point: timing. The Mulberry harbors provided massive logistics capacity during the critical first 3 months when no conventional ports were available. Those 3 months determined whether the invasion succeeded or was thrown back into the channel. The harbors bought time, and in war, time is often the most valuable resource of all. The storm-beaten concrete walls still visible off Arromanches are more than historical curiosities. They represent a fundamental truth about modern warfare that the Germans learned too late and the Allies understood just in time. Battles are won by bullets, but wars are won by logistics. The Mulberry harbors weren't glamorous. They didn't win dramatic victories or capture headlines. They simply worked, day after day, offloading the unglamorous necessities that armies require: fuel, food, ammunition, replacement parts. The German Atlantic Wall was a monument to defensive engineering. Bunkers, obstacles, minefields, all meticulously designed to destroy an invasion at the waterline. But walls, no matter how thick, can only defend positions. They can't attack logistics. The Allies didn't try to break the wall directly. They built around it, over it, and through it with industrial capacity the Germans couldn't match. There's a deeper lesson embedded in those concrete caissons. Innovation matters more than doctrine. Every military textbook said amphibious invasions required ports. The Allies rewrote the textbook because they had to.
When conventional solutions don't exist, unconventional engineering creates them. Churchill's half-joking memo, "Don't argue the matter, the difficulties will argue for themselves," turned out to be strategic genius. The difficulties did argue loudly and persistently, but engineers answered them with concrete, steel, and relentless problem-solving. The men who built and operated the Mulberry harbors weren't celebrated as heroes. Most of their names are forgotten. They didn't storm beaches or fly fighter planes. They poured concrete, welded steel, and drove trucks across floating roadways while German shells burst around them. Their war was mechanical, exhausting, and absolutely critical. Without them, the invasion would have starved on the beaches. 70 years later, tourists walk the beaches of Normandy and visit the cemeteries on the bluffs. They see the bunkers and the memorials. Most never notice the concrete blocks offshore, half submerged and barnacle-covered. Those who do rarely understand what they're looking at, the remnants of harbors that shouldn't have been possible but existed anyway, delivering millions of tons when it mattered most. The Mulberry harbors weren't elegant, they were brutal, practical solutions to impossible problems, and that's exactly what won the war. Not grace, not glory, but relentless, grinding, unglamorous logistics executed by ordinary people doing extraordinary work. The Germans couldn't believe Americans used concrete ships. By the time they understood what those ships had accomplished, it was too late. The supplies were ashore, the armies were advancing, and the war was already lost.